Dr. John Torres with NBC News on his Facebook Live. It's Monday, June 15th. We're halfway through the month of June, and we've made some headways on coronavirus, and we've made some fallbacks on coronavirus. I'll talk about that along with some other headlines you might have heard happening over the weekend and today, and explain a little bit more about those. But on top of that, once I'm through with that, I definitely want to answer some of your questions. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and send them to us. We'll get to as many of those as we can. And again, we're talking all things coronavirus here, so please feel free to ask anything you think you want information on. A couple things. Number one, a lot of things have reopened. Over the weekend, we noticed a lot of what we call pre-pandemic behavior. And that means that people were doing the things they used to do before the pandemic. They're getting in large groups. They weren't wearing masks. They weren't social distancing. And that's becoming a big concern because there are a multitude of states that are having increased cases of coronavirus. And as a matter of fact, some states are having more cases of coronavirus than they've ever had, even in the midst of the pandemic when we were at the top of that curve nationwide, as we kept talking about. It's so concerning that a couple of different areas are talking about closing down areas of the state again, like we had in the past. And this is something I talked about on Friday, that we definitely don't want to go back to where we were in February and March, where everything was starting to close down and we were starting to shelter in place. We don't want that to happen. So right now, Governor Cuomo in New York has said New York City, Manhattan in particular, and the Hamptons, which is a place where a lot of people go to escape New York City, they're not following their social distancing guidelines. And if you saw what was happening in bars and restaurants and other areas there of gatherings, that people were gathering in big numbers, they weren't social distancing. And as somebody put it, it almost looked like Lake of the Ozarks this last weekend in certain parts of Manhattan. The concern there is because people are doing that, they're not wearing masks, they're not social distancing, it's going to increase the cases again. So Governor Cuomo specifically said if New York City can't get its act together and get these things under control, he's going to move in with the state and shut down these different facilities and basically put us back to where we were a few weeks ago. Same thing is happening in Houston, where Houston cases are really increasing. And so the government there is looking at saying, okay, do we need to shut Houston down again? So these reopenings are going to start closing down again unless we do the things we know we need to do in order to keep it under control. Now, as I talked about on Friday, it is possible to keep the pandemic under control and to still reopen. We just need to make sure that we're doing our part. And that means the things we know, the things we've talked about, the things I have constantly talked about on Facebook Live: wearing masks, social distancing, not getting in large groups. That large group can be a little confusing because what does that mean? What's the number? There's no specific number because it depends on where you are and how you're meeting. If you're outdoors in a huge area, you have an acre to spread apart. That's different than if you're indoors in a small room. The rule of thumb typically tends to be around 10, but again, the CDC has not come out with any specific numbers. They're just saying make sure that the group size makes sense for the area you're in. Smaller groups indoors than outdoors because we know it spreads more indoors than outdoors because of airflow and ventilation. And so be careful there. And so that's with the reclosures. We're hoping we don't have to repeat that. I know you're hoping as well as I am that we don't have to get back to those levels, but time will tell. On top of that, the vaccine. There's some information out about the vaccine. It looks like it's probably coming sooner rather than later. We kept talking about 12 to 18 months. 12 months would be around February time frame, coming February 2021. Still looks like that's probably a good measure of when it's going to come. It's possible it could come by the end of the year. There have been some great strides taken in that, and there are some phase 3 trials going on right now. As the phase 3 trials going on, they're going to start producing the vaccine, which is the first time they've ever done this, because it's a huge gamble on their part to produce the vaccine, and phase 3 trial all of a sudden doesn't work, and so that vaccine just has to get thrown away. They have government backing to do that, so the company probably won't lose money. It'll probably be the taxpayers losing money, but at the same time, it's unprecedented. The reason they're doing that is because they want to make sure that vaccine is ready once it gets through phase 3 trials. But what some experts are saying now is we need to temper our expectations about the vaccine a little bit, because this vaccine is probably more along the lines of a vaccine that's going to help prevent us from getting too sick and help us recover from coronavirus versus a vaccine that actually prevents us from getting the infection in the first place. That vaccine will get here. It'll probably take longer to get here. But this first salvo of vaccines, I think, will be more along the line of if you get it, you won't get as sick. And if you do start getting sick, we can give you the vaccine and can help you recover from it. And so again, temper those expectations a little bit, but it looks like it might be coming earlier, sooner than we thought, hopefully. But we'll keep our fingers crossed. We'll know more as the months go on. But the big push here is to get as many vaccines out as possible, get everybody vaccinated so we can get that herd immunity level we keep talking about in order to protect everybody else from getting coronavirus, because we do know in the fall it's going to come back. And speaking of coming back in the fall, one of the things we're looking at is what's going to happen when it does come back in the fall. Are we going to have to reinstitute all the closures, all the shutdowns, all the sheltering in place that we had at the beginning? And the answer looks like probably not. And what's happening here, it's definitely happening in Europe. And some governments, particularly in Ireland, they have said we are not going to close everything down. We are simply going to target closures. And what they mean by that is they're going to look at where the origin of the infections are coming from. If they're coming from a nursing home, if they're coming from a certain community, then target that community for shutting down limitedly what they need to keep it under control, but not going statewide, nationwide, as shutdowns that we've had in the past. We've learned from what happened in the past. We know now a little bit more about coronavirus and what we need to do to target them. And again, Europe has talked about that, not shutting down completely, just targeting those shutdowns. And I think you're going to hear people here in the United States talk about that as well, because as we've talked about in the past, it doesn't make sense to shut down the whole country if the cases are in one specific region of the country, but it does make sense to target the locations, maybe target travel in and out of the locations. So I think that's what you can look forward to going into the future here. And then the last one I want to talk about is hydroxychloroquine. The FDA today just announced that they are actually revoking the emergency use authorization for hydroxychloroquine. If you remember, a couple of months ago, they authorized this emergency use authorization. It's not an approval, it's an emergency use authorization, meaning we don't really fully know all the risks and benefits behind it, but we think it might be helpful enough and not too risky that we can go ahead and give them this temporary authorization. Well, they've revoked that authorization now because they're saying hydroxychloroquine in the trials we had has simply not panned out. It has not prevented deaths. It has not prevented hospitalizations. It has not prevented ICU stays. And in the most recent trial, it hasn't even prevented infections in those who are more susceptible to infections because of contact exposure. And so they're saying now that the risks of hydroxychloroquine, the main one being cardiac arrhythmias, outweigh the benefits or the potential benefits because we're simply not seeing those benefits. Studies are still going on, and we might learn more as those studies go on, and that might change the outlook and what happens with it. But as of now, they've revoked that emergency use authorization. So people going into hospital won't be getting it like they had been prior to this when they had that emergency use authorization. So again, the big things, reclosures happening across the country. It's possible. We can help prevent that by doing those things we know that we need to do to keep safe and keep everybody else safe. That means masks, social distancing, and no large groups. The vaccine looks like it might be sooner rather than later. Let's hope so. Just keep our fingers crossed. But if it does happen, it might not be the full robust vaccine we were used to from other things. It might be a vaccine that just helps us not get us sick from this. And then the last one, hydroxychloroquine, again, its emergency use authorization has been revoked, and so don't expect to see it out there for any kind of treatment at this point. Trials are going on, though, and hopefully those trials will give us some more answers about that and other medicines and treatments as well. So now let's see what kind of questions you have and what kind of answers I can give you.
Can the antibody test give a negative result, and can you lose antibodies?
So can the antibody test give you a negative result, and can you lose antibodies? So first, a couple of things. One, with the antibody test, it can definitely give you a negative result if you don't have any antibodies. It can certainly do that. But it can also do what's called a false negative, meaning that you do have antibodies, but when you take the test, it shows you don't have antibodies. That rate of that happening with what we call the serum antibody test, which are where you get a blood draw out of your inside your elbow here. They send it off to the lab. It takes a day or two to come back. Those ones are fairly accurate. They have both good, what we call specificity, and good sensitivity. And so its false negatives and false positive rates are very, very low. They're looking at authorizing some finger prick tests, which will be more in clinic or possibly even at home type tests. The concern with those is those have the high false negative rate. That false negative rate could be as high as 15-20%. The concern there is people might not know they have these antibodies. The other concern is if they get a false positive test. The false positive test means that the test said they were positive when in fact they don't have any antibodies. That's even more concerning because they might go out and not do those things we just talked about, masks and social distancing, because they think they're protected from coronavirus when in fact they don't have any antibodies to begin with. The tests are just false negative. And people have taken a test where they have taken one test, they're positive, they've taken another test, they're negative, a third test is positive. So these tests, the issue with them is these tests are brand new because the coronavirus is brand new. As we get more numbers of people in the test, it's a numbers game. The more people that get tested, the more they can fine-tune that accuracy. And so we're still at limited numbers of tests at this stage. As the years go on, the accuracy will get better, but it's still very good, especially for the serum one. but certainly not perfect. And that's probably the biggest message here. Oh, no, sorry. The second part of the question is, can your antibodies go away? Yes, definitely the antibodies can go away. And what we do know is that short term, people are not getting second infections of coronavirus. And so we think the antibodies are giving them that short term protection. What we don't know is how long that protection lasts. And it might last 6 months, it might last 2 years, it might last a lifetime. We simply don't know. The only way to tell will be with time. And so we'll know over time, just monitoring people to see what happens with their antibodies. But as for now, we know it protects you at least short term, but long term, we're not sure.
How did this pathogen come into being? Could it have been man-made?
So the question is, how did this virus come into being? Could it have been man-made? And the answer is no, it was not man-made for a couple of reasons. One is we're simply not that advanced in science to be able to make something as complicated as this virus and the way this virus is moving throughout the world. And number two, there are some rumors, there have been in the past, about a biohazardous lab in Wuhan, China, where a worker was exposed and brought it out. That was different. That was not an engineered virus. That was a virus they were studying, and there's no evidence that that worker actually brought it out. What we do know is, looking at the genetic sequence, there are two different things that have contributed to this from their genetic sequencing they've been able to do. One of them is the genetic sequence gets very close to the bat virus that's out there. And number two, it also gets very close to what's called a pangolin, which is kind of a cross between an anteater and an armadillo, if you see a picture of it. Those are animals that are in these markets in China. And so they think either it passed from the bat to the pangolin to humans, or somehow that combination of those two with human contact got it to the humans as well. And that's how we ended up getting it. So as far as it being man-made, the answer is no, it's not man-made. It looks like it comes from these animals, but how it got to humans is the question that I don't know if we're ever going to get the answer to, but they're certainly looking hard now to try and find out if they can get that answer.
Are the various companies working together to develop this vaccine?
So the question is, are the various companies working together? Some companies are working together, some companies are working apart and on their own. Last number I looked, which was today, there are about 130 different vaccines that are out there being experimented with and tried. Some of these are huge companies and governments that have backed them. The United States government, the NIH, the National Institute of Health, has backed some vaccines as well. They're looking into those. Those are the ones they think are going to be the front runners and have the best chance of being out there and being produced. Others are companies that are doing it on their own on this, just to see if they can come up with a vaccine as well. And I think what you're going to see here is these 130 companies kind of funnel down into probably 5 or 6 vaccines that are going to be out there and be offered to the public. This is not going to be a one vaccine for everybody type of thing. This is going to be vaccines that are going to be a variety of different ones that are going to be offered. 1, depending on your location, 2, depending on your country, 3, possibly depending on your age and your own health status. One of the concerns with the vaccine is here in the United States, not as big of a problem. Most vaccines need refrigeration and careful handling. We can do that easily here in the United States, but in some underdeveloped countries or developing countries, it's a little harder because, especially you can imagine in some of these areas where you go deep into the jungle or deep into the desert, you might not be able to get that refrigeration. So they're looking at trying to find out if they can get what's called a powderized form of the vaccine, where you have the vaccine in a powder form. You simply add sterile saline to it or sterile water to it to get it to its buffered state, and then you can give it to somebody that way. That makes it a little more complicated. But what they're trying to do is make sure they don't give a vaccine that only works for people that have refrigeration, that they get a vaccine that works for anybody in any certain circumstance. And so that's one of the challenges they're trying to meet right now, because this is not a vaccine that is targeted just for the U.S. or just for the northeast of the U.S. This is a vaccine that's targeted for the whole world, because if we can't get the coronavirus under control around the world, we're going to have issues. And right now we're seeing that in the south of the equator, particularly in Central and South America, where they're having issues with the coronavirus right now. The cases are really cropping up, and the pandemic curve is on the rise down there. We just need to make sure that they get that controlled. We get those vaccines so everybody can get it controlled, so we can get back to at least our near normal life in the future.
Does marijuana have any uses in combating COVID?
So the question is, does marijuana have any uses in combating COVID? None that we know of right at this point. And the simple fact is that this virus is so new. If you remember, the first time we heard about it was January, February, that those studies have not been done. Those would be more long-term studies looking at it, but at this point, no. But one thing we do know is that your lungs are very susceptible to this virus. And once it gets in your body, your lungs are very susceptible to damage from this virus. And that's why we know that tobacco smoke can actually cause issues, because you're not going to recover as quickly, and it could actually cause lung complications. With marijuana smoke, it's possible that could be the same thing. We just simply don't know. There are components in marijuana that make us concerned about what happens inside the lungs with coronavirus. There are other components of marijuana that make us less concerned about it, and possibly even potential for some things to benefit. But at this stage, we simply don't know. So my recommendation would be not to smoke marijuana, especially if you're going to be in an area where you're at high risk for exposure, especially if you have other health conditions, or if you're 65 plus, it puts you even at a greater risk of exposure and complications from coronavirus. So again, you just want to be very careful with that. But the honest answer is we simply don't know marijuana, CBD, what effects those might have on coronavirus or COVID-19. We'll know as time goes on. And again, this is going to be one of those multi-year things. Now, one thing to remember too, is in the history of pandemics, looking at pandemics across the world over the last centuries, pandemics are never a singular event. They're never a one-time occurrence that just happens over a few months and goes away. These are multi-year events. And usually what happens is we get this huge spike that affects the whole world. That spike calms down, then we get another spike that isn't quite as big, and that calms down, then another spike. You get the story here. However, that doesn't mean that we can't have a huge spike, and then the second year, an even a larger spike. And so if you look at the 1918 flu, for example, they basically did exactly what we're doing now, completely shut everything down. People were wearing masks, no mass gatherings. They learned from the initial part of the flu what caused that flu to propagate through the populations, and they switched and changed for the second part of the outbreak to try and get it under control. They did get it under control, and were able to get to life back to normal. And that's the same thing we're going to do here. We are going to get this under control. We're going to get our life back to normal. Might be what we call a new normal, especially work environments and things like that. But it's going to be a lot closer than what we are right now. So again, to reiterate the news and what's going on, we're talking about reclosures across the country. Those could happen, and there have been threats from the governor of New York and other governors around the country that could possibly happen if we're not seeing people doing the things we know they need to do in order to keep this virus under control. Vaccine. The race is on. Hopefully we get it sooner rather than later. And then hydroxychloroquine, again, its emergency use authorization has been revoked. And so you're not going to see it used as much out there, mainly for clinical trials at this point. So it's Monday, June 15th, the beginning of the week. Hopefully we get more good news as this week goes on, and we're showing the fight against coronavirus is working. We just need to make sure we're all doing our parts to help make sure that it does work, and we get back to that near normal as soon as possible. But in the meanwhile, please stay happy, please stay healthy, and take care of each other. Thanks.